So far we've talked about the creation and perfection of secured transactions. Now we'll talk about the scope of a security agreement as well as priorities. Now we know that creation and perfection of secured transactions are important. We should also know that a security interest has a scope of coverage, and that scope of coverage may extend beyond the original collateral to include collateral that was not present at the time of the execution of the security agreement. We also have to be concerned about priority of security agreements. When there are two or more parties that have interest in collateral, how do we know who determines which party gets it? And the priority rules provided by the UCC indicate which party has the superior right to recover. So today we're going to look at how security interests operate. And after this lecture, you should be able to answer the following questions. What do we mean by the scope of security interest, and how are disputes regarding priority handled? Now, every security interest has a scope of coverage. That means it's going to extend to certain collateral. And a security interest can cover property other than that in the debtor's possession, meaning a security interest can reach other types of property beyond that which is in the debtor's possession at the time of the execution of the security agreement. Now we have names for those other types of property, and we'll talk about each of those in more detail. Proceeds are going to be the money or assets received when collateral is sold or otherwise disposed of. After acquired property refers to property that's acquired by the debtor after the execution of the security agreement. Future advances refers to future advances against a line of credit that are subject to a properly perfected security interest is in the same collateral that secured the initial loan. And finally, a floating lien. A floating lien refers to a security interest in collateral that's retained even though the collateral changes its character or classification or location. So let's look at each one of those in more detail, starting with proceeds. Remember, proceeds are the money or other valuable assets received when collateral is sold or otherwise disposed of. Proceeds include whatever is received when the collateral is sold or disposed in some other way. So if a creditor has a security interest in the inventory of a farm machinery retailer, if that retailer sells a tractor out of its inventory and it does so on credit with payments due, that means those payments are subject to the security interest of the creditor despite the fact that they are not inventory. So it's going to be the proceeds from what was previously inventory. Now, security interest in proceeds perfects automatically on the perfection of the secured party's security interest in the original collateral. So security interest in proceeds will follow the security interest in the original collateral. And the security interest remains perfected after receipt of proceeds by the debtor. And the second type of property that we're going to look at has to do with after acquired property. And after acquired property is a property acquired by the debtor after the execution of the original security agreement. So if a company gives to a creditor a security interest in equipment, as the company purchases new equipment, both the previous equipment and the new equipment are subject to the security interest. So this type of security agreement is very useful for inventory financing arrangements. If we create a security interest in your collateral in your inventory, that means as new products come into that inventory, our security interest will extend to cover those products as well. Now, the original security interest may not be superior to the rights of others. So if For instance, there is a purchase money security interest in a piece of property that's going to be intended for, say it's intended for inventory. The purchase money security interest may be superior to that original creditor's security interest. Future advances is another another situation. These are, say, withdrawals against a line of credit are subject to a properly perfected security interest in the same collateral that secures the initial loan. Now, a line of credit, of course, allows a debtor to borrow intermittently. So a company executes a line of credit loan with the lender. The line of credit is $400,000. The company pledges equipment as collateral. The lender perfects a security interest in that equipment. The lender stays perfected as the borrower borrows more. So advances against lines of credit are subject to a properly perfected security interest. And finally, cross-collateralization occurs when an asset that's not the subject of the loan is used to collateralize that loan. A floating lien. A floating lien references a security interest in collateral that's retained even when the collateral changes in character, classification, or location. Floating liens commonly arise in the financing of inventories. A creditor is not interested in specific pieces of inventory, so the lien will float from one item to another as the inventory changes. So if a bicycle dealer has a credit agreement with a bank, and the credit agreement is meant to finance an inventory of bicycles, the security agreement may provide for coverage of proceeds, after acquired inventory, present inventory, future advances. If one day the bicycle dealer sells a new bicycle and receives a used bike in trade, and then later purchases 2 new bikes from a manufacturer using cash, and then borrows money from the line of credit to use to meet payroll, the bank would have a perfected security interest in the used bike, a perfected security interest in the 2 new bikes under the after acquired property clause, and all of the inventory is subject to the security interest under the future advances clause. So the floating lien can apply to a shifting stock of goods. So the lien can start with raw materials, follow them as they become finished goods, and then continue as the goods are sold and turned into cash or accounts receivable or commercial paper. Priorities. When 2 or more parties claim an interest in the same collateral, who has priority? Well, the UCC is going to set out those rules. Now, there is a general rule regarding priority. And if you're ever confused, you can rely on this general rule. The general rule states that perfection of the security interest is the most important element in determining priority. The general rule states that a secured party's interest has priority over an unsecured creditor, an unperfected secured creditor, a subsequent lien creditor, and a trustee in bankruptcy, and finally, buyers who are not purchasing in the ordinary course of business. So a perfected secured party's interest has priorities over any of these parties. So when determining priority, which is one of the things you're going to have to do, understand the most important thing is a perfection of a secured interest. What about conflicts among creditors? Sometimes conflicts exist among creditors. When secured creditors are in conflict, the first in time rule usually applies. So for instance, if we have conflicting perfected security interest, so two or more secured parties have perfected security interest in the same collateral, generally the first party to perfect or to file and subsequently perfect has priority. A purchase money security interest, however, prevails over a prior perfected non-purchase money security interest in the same collateral. So even if there was a prior perfected security interest, it is subject to a purchase money security interest. What about perfected versus unperfected security interest? When two or more secured parties have perfected securities in the same collateral, then generally the first to perfect or to file and subsequently perfect has priority. So the perfected security interest, even if it was after the original security agreement, the other security agreement, the conflicting security agreement, the first perfected security interest will have priority. Conflicting unperfected security interest. When two or more secured parties have unperfected security interest in the same collateral, the first to attach has priority. When one secured party has a perfected security interest in collateral and another secured party has an unperfected security interest in the same collateral, the perfected security interest prevails. Secured versus an unsecured creditor. A secured creditor will prevail against unsecured creditors and any judgment creditors who've not yet begun the legal process to collect on their judgment. Who's an unsecured creditor? Unsecured creditor will be any party that loans money but doesn't take an interest in collateral. So of course the best example is a credit card issuer. So in this case, the credit card issuer, the unsecured creditor, is going to be subject to priority beneath the secured creditor. Regardless of the time of the extension of credit, the secured creditor has a priority over that collateral. A secured party versus a lien holder. A lien holder would be a party that has a claim against property. And again, a perfected security interest prevails against a lien holder's claim that arose after perfection. An unperfected secured party would prevail over unsecured creditors and creditors who've attained judgment against the debtor. What about conflicts between buyers and creditors? Conflicts can exist between creditors and subsequent purchasers of the collateral. That's what we're talking about when we talk about buyers. So, say a creditor has a security interest in inventory. That inventory is purchased by a buyer, and so then the question is who has a superior right to that property, that collateral now. And the applicable rule to solve this problem involves the status of the buyer. What type of buyer is this buyer? So a conflict between a secured creditor and subsequent buyers of the collateral, it's going to depend on what type of buyer it is. The first is a buyer in the ordinary course of business, and a person in the ordinary course of business is a buyer, a person who buys goods in good faith and without any knowledge that the sale is in violation of a third party's ownership rights or security interest. Now, this purchase must be from a person who's in the business of selling goods of the kind. Now, this buyer will take the goods free of any security interest. So even though the seller of the goods has given a security interest in the good to a secured creditor, a buyer in the ordinary course of business, the buyer is acting in good faith, will take priority over that secured creditor. So the buyer in the ordinary course of business has priority over a secured creditor, even if the security interest is perfected and the buyer knows of the security interest. So as long as the buyer doesn't have knowledge that the sale is violating a third party's ownership rights, the buyer has priority over a secured creditor. Now, different rule for buyers not in the ordinary course of business. A buyer who buys goods other than in the ordinary course of the seller's business will take the goods free of any unperfected security interest, but subject to a perfected one. So if you go in to buy a pair of shoes from a shoe dealer, ordinarily you're going to buy a pair or two pair of shoes and walk out the door for your personal use. That's a buyer in the ordinary course. Even if those shoes were subject to a security interest, the buyer in the ordinary course will take the shoes free of that interest. However, if you go in and you buy the entire inventory from the shoe dealer, intending to go open your own business and sell those shoes, that's not in the ordinary course of business, because that's not what the shoe dealer ordinarily does. So in that case, you would take the goods free of any unperfected security interest, but you are subject to a perfected one. A second-hand buyer of consumer goods. And a second-hand buyer, we're talking about a person who purchases goods for personal or household use without knowledge of a prior security interest from a seller who also held the goods for household use. That buyer will take the goods free of any unfiled security interest. If the security interest is filed, however, the creditor wins. So in conclusion, what did we learn today? Every security interest has a scope of coverage. When two or more parties have security interests in the same collateral, it's necessary to determine who has priority. The UCC contains those rules of priority. And that's it. Thanks for listening.